I kicked at a fallen branch blocking the trail, sending it tumbling into the bushes. 3 weeks into September, and the forest still held onto summer's warmth, though the mornings carried that crisp edge that warned of autumn's approach. My boots found their rhythm on the packed dirt path as I made my way deeper into the remote sections of Olympic National Forest. This part of the patrol route took me through areas most visitors never saw, too far from the main trails, too dense with Douglas firs and western hemlocks for casual hikers. Perfect for wildlife, which meant perfect for the kind of discoveries that kept my job interesting. Usually that meant tracks from elk or the occasional black bear, maybe some damage from storms that needed clearing. The pale ring caught my eye from 20 yards away. Mushrooms grew in circles out here sometimes. Fairy rings, people called them, though I'd never seen one quite so perfectly formed. The fungi stood maybe 4 inches tall, their caps a washed-out beige that almost glowed against the dark forest floor. Each mushroom positioned with mathematical precision, creating a circle roughly 6 feet across. I stepped closer and stopped dead. A rabbit lay in the center of the ring, but not in any way that made sense. The animal was positioned on its back, legs splayed as if someone had carefully arranged it there. Its fur remained intact except for one area. The entire top of its head had been peeled back like opening a can, exposing bone underneath. The skull showed a clean crack running from ear to ear, split with surgical precision. Inside, where the brain should have been, I found only hollow bone, completely empty, as if someone had scooped out every trace of tissue with medical instruments. I crouched down, careful not to disturb the scene. No blood pooled around the body. No signs of struggle in the surrounding dirt. The rabbit looked like it had been placed there deliberately, positioned for display rather than abandoned after some violent encounter. My camera came out automatically. Years of documenting unusual findings had taught me to record first, theorize later. I shot the scene from multiple angles: the perfect circle of mushrooms, the precisely mutilated rabbit, the unsettling way everything looked arranged rather than natural. The forest around me felt too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling in the brush. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had faded to nothing. Like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I bagged the camera and stood up, my knees protesting the crouch. Whatever had done this possessed skills no local predator could match. Bears tore things apart. Cougars left claw marks. Even human poachers worked messily, focused on speed rather than precision. This looked clinical, professional. The radio crackled as I hiked back toward the main trail system. Frank's voice cut through the static, checking my position for the afternoon meetup. Normal patrol business, normal procedures. But my mind kept circling back to that empty skull and those perfectly spaced mushrooms. 2 days later, Frank found me at the ranger station during our morning briefing, his face carrying that particular expression I'd learned to recognize over our 3 years as partners. Something was bothering him. "You need to see what I came across yesterday," he said, dropping into the chair across from my desk. "Up on the North Ridge Trail, about 2 miles past the overlook." He pulled out his phone and swiped to a photo that made my stomach tighten. Another mushroom circle, larger than the one I'd found, maybe 8 feet across. Same pale fungi, same mathematical spacing. At the center lay a deer, a young buck with small antlers, positioned on its side in a way that looked deliberate, like someone had taken care with the placement. The head had been split open with the same surgical precision I'd seen on the rabbit. Brain cavity completely empty, bone surfaces clean and precise. "What the hell is this?" Frank asked, showing me additional photos from different angles. I pulled up my own pictures on my phone, watching his expression change as he scrolled through them. The patterns matched exactly. The spacing of the mushrooms, the surgical precision of the wounds, the complete absence of brain tissue. "Found mine 3 days ago," I said. "Different location, but same setup. Aim." Frank leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, so we've got 2 identical scenes, different animals, different locations. Someone's doing this on purpose. Has to be. No animal works this clean, and no natural process creates patterns like this. Prank by local kids, maybe? Some kind of sick art project? I wanted to agree with him, wanted to grab onto that rational explanation, but something about how perfect it was bothered me. Kids don't have the tools for this kind of work. Look at those cuts. They're perfect, like someone used medical equipment. Frank looked at the photos again, his mouth set in a grim line. Cultists? In Olympic National Forest? Come on. Stranger things have happened. Remember that group up near Mount Rainier last year? They were doing weird stuff with animal sacrifices before the feds shut them down. Maybe he was right. People did strange things in the wilderness, thinking the isolation gave them freedom to act out fantasies they couldn't pursue in town. But how precise these cuts were suggested knowledge and equipment beyond what most amateur groups had. We should report this, I said, though part of me hesitated. File an official incident report, get the sheriff's department involved. Frank was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photos. 2 incidents, both in remote areas that see maybe 1 visitor a month. No human victims, no threat to public safety that we can identify. Filing a report means bringing in investigators, media attention, probably closing sections of the forest while they poke around. He had a point. The Forest Service preferred to handle unusual situations internally when possible. Involving outside agencies meant paperwork, questions, and the kind of publicity that made tourists nervous. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "Document everything. Monitor the situation. If more circles show up, we'll have better data to present. If it's kids or some cult, they'll probably get bored and move on. If it's something else," he shrugged, "we'll deal with it then." The plan made sense from a bureaucratic standpoint. No immediate danger, no clear threat to visitors, and plenty of weird but harmless things happened in the forest that never made it into official reports. Local indigenous tribes had dozens of stories about strange phenomena in these woods, most of which we filed under unexplained but not dangerous. I saved the GPS coordinates from both sites and marked them on our patrol map. Whatever was creating these circles might follow a pattern, stick to certain areas or trail systems. More data would help us figure out if we were dealing with human activity or something else entirely. "Keep cameras ready during patrols," I said, "and don't approach any more circles alone. If there's a 3rd one, we call it in immediately." Frank nodded, sliding his phone back into his pocket. Probably just some weirdo with too much time and a biology textbook. But yeah, better safe than sorry. We spent the rest of the morning reviewing patrol schedules and maintenance reports. Normal ranger business that felt good after the morning's disturbing discoveries. But as I headed out for my afternoon rounds, those images stayed with me. The empty skulls, the precise cuts, the mathematical perfection of those pale mushroom rings. The forest had always held secrets. Most of them were harmless, quirks of nature or leftover stuff from human activity from decades past. Sometimes we found old mining equipment or abandoned campsites from before the area became protected land. Once, Frank discovered a rusted truck from the 1940s, completely hidden by decades of growth. But this felt different, deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. I checked my camera battery twice before starting the trail and made sure my radio was charged and working. Whatever was creating those circles might still be out there, and I intended to be ready if I found another one. I spent the week after finding those mushroom circles checking and rechecking my patrol routes, camera ready, nerves on edge every time I spotted anything unusual in the forest floor. Frank and I had agreed to document everything, but the waiting felt worse than finding actual evidence. Every shadow between the trees looked suspicious. Every natural formation made me pause to examine it more closely. The morning the Johnson family arrived, I was finishing my equipment check at the ranger station when their blue Honda Pilot pulled into the parking area. A man climbed out of the driver's seat, stretching his back after what looked like a long drive. His wife got out from the passenger side, already looking around with the alert expression of someone who'd done this before. Then the back door flew open and a kid bounded out like he'd been shot from a cannon. "Dad, can we set up the tent right now? Can we start a fire? Are there bears here?" The boy couldn't have been more than 8, all elbows and knees and endless energy. His parents had dressed him right. Strong hiking boots, layers that could be changed for temperature differences, a small backpack that actually looked like it fit him rather than some adult hand-me-down. I grabbed my clipboard and walked over to them. "You folks must be the Johnson family. Campsite 12? "That's us," the father said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone who worked with his hands. "I'm Dave Johnson. This is my wife Linda, and our son Corey." Corey was bouncing on his toes, practically vibrating with excitement. "Is this really my first camping trip? Are we going to sleep outside? What if it rains?" "We've got a good tent," Linda said, ruffling his hair. "And Ranger Thompson here will make sure we're all set up safely." I walked them through the standard check-in process: campfire regulations, food storage requirements, emergency procedures. Dave asked intelligent questions about trail conditions and wildlife activity. Linda had clearly studied the area maps ahead of time. They knew what they were doing. But Corey made the whole routine worth repeating. He listened to every word I said like I was revealing state secrets, his eyes wide when I mentioned the proper way to hang food bags away from bears. "Have you ever seen a bear?" he asked me. "A few times. Mostly they want nothing to do with people. As long as you follow the rules your parents learned, you'll be fine." "What about wolves?" "No wolves in this part of the forest. Just deer, some elk if you're lucky, maybe a raccoon trying to get into your supplies." I finished the paperwork and handed Dave the campsite map with their location marked. "You're about a quarter-mile down the main trail, then left at the wooden marker. Nice spot. Close enough to the facilities, far enough for some privacy." "Thanks," Dave said. "Any other families with kids camping this week?" "Not right now. It's pretty quiet during the school year." Corey's face fell slightly at that news, but Linda squeezed his shoulder. "That just means more space for us to explore, buddy." I watched them drive toward their campsite, the Honda loaded down with enough gear for a week-long expedition, even though they'd only booked 3 nights. Dave had mentioned this was Corey's first real camping experience, and they'd clearly invested in making it memorable. The next morning during my rounds, I could hear them before I saw them. Corey's voice carried through the trees as he peppered his father with questions about every bird call, every rustling bush, every interesting rock formation. When I got close enough to check on them, I found the family finishing breakfast around a properly built campfire. "Morning, folks. How was the first night?" "Great," Linda said, though she looked a little tired. Someone was too excited to sleep much. Corey grinned at me, his face smudged with dirt and what looked like marshmallow residue. "We heard an owl, and something walked around our tent, but Dad said it was probably just a deer." Probably was. They're curious about campers sometimes. Dave poured coffee from a camp percolator that looked well used. "Any recommendations for day hikes with an 8-year-old? I pulled out the trail map and showed them a few options. Nothing too challenging, but enough to give Corey the sense of real wilderness exploration he was craving. They planned to tackle the waterfall trail that afternoon, maybe try the ridge loop the next day. "Sounds perfect," Linda said. "We'll check in with you if we change plans." I left them plotting their route and continued my patrol, but something felt different about the forest that morning. The same unnatural quiet I'd noticed around the mushroom circles seemed to hover at the edges of my awareness. Birds called from the overhead cover, but their songs sounded muted. The usual rustle of small animals moving through the bushes was absent. Frank found me at the overlook around noon, radio crackling with his position update. "Checking the Johnson family later?" he asked. "Planned on it. They seem solid, but it's the kid's first time. Want to make sure he's not getting overwhelmed." "Good call. First camping trips either hook kids for life or traumatize them completely." We looked over the rest of our patrol schedules and went our separate ways. Frank went north toward the ridge trails while I worked my way back through the central campground area. The afternoon passed quietly. A few day hikers asked for directions. I cleared some fallen branches from the main trail, and I wrote down a damaged picnic table that needed repair. Around 4 o'clock, I stopped by campsite 12 again. The Johnson family had returned from their waterfall hike, and Corey was talking excitedly to his mother while his father cleaned their hiking boots. "We saw fish," Corey announced when he spotted me, "and Mom let me put my feet in the water even though it was cold." "The falls are beautiful this time of year," I said. "How did the trail treat you?" "He was a trooper," Dave said proudly. "Made it the whole way without complaining once." Linda was organizing their camping gear with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to stay ahead of chaos. "We're thinking about the ridge trail tomorrow, but maybe just part way up if Corey's legs are sore." "That's smart. The first half has the best views anyway." I spent a few more minutes talking with them about trail conditions and dinner plans, then left to complete my evening rounds. The forest felt normal again, birds calling from their evening perches, the sounds of wind through branches and small creatures moving in the brush. The radio woke me at 5:30 in the morning. "Michael, you there?" Frank's voice unusually tense. I grabbed the handset. "Yeah, what's wrong?" "Mrs. Johnson is here at the station. Her kid's missing." My blood went cold. I threw on my uniform and drove to the ranger station faster than regulations allowed. Linda Johnson was walking back and forth in front of the building, her face pale and drawn. Dave stood nearby, talking rapidly into his cell phone. "Mrs. Johnson," I said, hurrying over to them, "tell me what happened." Her hands shook as she spoke. "Corey was in his sleeping bag between us. We always set up that way, with him in the middle of the tent. I woke up around 5 and he was gone. The tent zipper was open." "Could he have gotten up to use the bathroom?" That's what we thought at first. Dave went to check the facilities, but he wasn't there. We've been searching around the campsite for the last half hour. Dave finished his phone call and joined us. No cell service out there. Had to drive here to call the sheriff's department. Frank appeared with a cup of coffee for Linda, who wrapped her hands around it like she was trying to get warm. "When did you last see him?" "Right before bed, around 9 o'clock. He was tired from the hike, fell asleep almost immediately." "Any sounds during the night? Anything that might have woken him up?" Dave shook his head. "Nothing. We're both light sleepers, especially in the tent. If he'd gotten up, we would have heard the zipper." I felt that knot forming in my stomach, the same feeling I'd had standing over those cut-up animals in their perfect mushroom circles. "Frank, call in the rest of the team. Full search protocol." Within an hour, all 5 members of our ranger staff had gathered at campsite 12. Stephen Martinez, our head ranger, arrived with detailed maps and search grid assignments. We divided the area into zones going out from the Johnson campsite, each team responsible for a specific area. The first phase covered a half-mile radius. Anywhere an 8-year-old might reasonably wander if he'd gotten up confused or looking for a bathroom. We searched every trail junction, every creek crossing, every clearing where a lost child might have stopped to rest. Nothing. By noon, the sheriff's department had arrived with tracking dogs. German shepherds trained to follow human scent, led by handlers who'd found dozens of missing persons over the years. The dogs picked up Corey's trail at the tent entrance, followed it about 20 yards into the forest, then lost it completely. "That's unusual," the lead handler told me, crouched next to his frustrated dog. "Scent doesn't just disappear like that. Wind, rain, time, those things can scatter it. But this is like the trail just stops." I watched the dog circle the area where the scent ended, whining softly as it looked for any trace of the boy. The spot looked like any other patch of forest floor. Fallen leaves, a few ferns, nothing remarkable. By the second day, word had spread to neighboring towns. Volunteers arrived in pickup trucks and SUVs, organized into search teams by the sheriff's deputies. We expanded the search radius to 3 miles, then 5. Helicopter overflights checked the treetops for any sign of movement or bright clothing. Linda Johnson barely slept, stationed at our makeshift command post with maps spread in front of her, marking off each grid section as teams reported back. Dave joined the ground searches, his face grim with determination and growing desperation. "Kids this age don't just vanish," he said to me during a brief rest break. "Someone would have found something by now, a piece of clothing, footprints, anything." He was right. In my 7 years as a forest ranger, I'd been part of dozens of search operations. Lost hikers, missing campers, confused elderly folks who'd wandered off from group outings. We always found evidence: torn fabric on branches, disturbed ground where someone had fallen, personal items dropped along a trail. Corey Johnson had left no trace whatsoever. The third day brought helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, volunteers with metal detectors checking for the boy's belt buckle or zipper pulls, even a team of cave specialists exploring the limestone formations on the ridge slopes. The search area now covered nearly 100 square miles of rugged wilderness. At sunset, Stephen Martinez made the call to scale back operations. "We've covered every accessible area twice," he announced to the assembled searchers. "Tomorrow we'll do one final sweep of the primary zones, but after that..." He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. After 3 days without food or water, out in nighttime temperatures in the 40s, an 8-year-old's chances of survival were basically zero. Linda Johnson broke down completely when Stephen delivered the news. Dave held her while she cried, his own face wet with tears he'd been holding back for days. Watching them pack their camping gear felt like seeing something sacred and terrible, the taking apart of what had been a family adventure just days before. "We're not giving up," Linda said as they loaded their Honda. "He's smart, he's tough. Corey could still be out there." I nodded and shook Dave's hand. But we both knew the truth. The forest had swallowed their son completely, leaving behind no evidence he'd ever existed at all. As I watched their car disappear down the access road, that weird quiet settled over the trees again, heavy and waiting, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. 5 days of regular patrols had passed since I watched the Johnson family's Honda disappear down the access road, but my sleep stayed broken and my nerves stayed on edge. Every evening, check brought back memories of Corey's excited chatter about bears and owls, and every empty campsite reminded me of that terrible morning when Linda Johnson's panicked voice had come through my radio. The search teams were long gone, the volunteers had returned to their normal lives, and the forest had settled back into its usual rhythms, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something basic had changed in these woods. The college group arrived on a Friday afternoon in 2 vehicles packed with enough gear for a week-long expedition. 4 students from the University of Washington, judging by the stickers on their Jeep Wrangler and the way they immediately started debating the best spot to pitch their tents. They'd reserved Campsite 7, which put them about a mile from where the Johnsons had been staying, close enough to some decent day trails, but far enough from the main facilities to feel properly isolated. I grabbed my clipboard and walked over to them as they began unloading sleeping bags and a camp stove that looked like it had seen plenty of use. The group consisted of 2 couples, early 20s, dressed in the kind of high-end outdoor gear that college students bought with credit cards and graduation money. They moved with that easy confidence of people who'd done this before and knew they were good at it. "Evening, folks. I'm Ranger Thompson. You're the Patel Reservation?" A young woman with her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail looked up from organizing their cooking supplies. "That's us. I'm Priya. This is my boyfriend Jake. And that's Emma and Marcus." Jake had the lean build of a serious hiker, all strong muscle and sun-weathered skin. He shook my hand with a firm grip. "Great spot you've got here. How are the trail conditions?" "Pretty good for this time of year, some fallen branches here and there, but nothing that'll slow you down." I walked them through the standard check-in procedures, but my mind kept circling back to Corey Johnson's empty sleeping bag and the way his parents' voices had cracked when they called his name through the trees. Marcus was setting up their tent with the careful moves of someone who'd done it dozens of times. "Any wildlife activity we should know about?" Bears? Cougars? This was where I needed to be careful. We did have an incident recently. A family was camping here last week and their 8-year-old son went missing. We searched for 3 days but never found him. Emma paused in the middle of hanging their food bags from a nearby tree branch. Missing how? Like he wandered off? Left his tent sometime during the night. Just vanished. I kept my voice level, professional, but I could feel the weight of those empty days pressing down on me. Point is, this area can be unpredictable. I'd recommend staying close to your campsite after dark, keeping your group together. Priya and Emma exchanged glances, but Jake just shrugged. Kids get turned around in the woods all the time. Probably fell in a creek or got picked up by a search team from a different sector. The search covered nearly 100 square miles. Professional teams with dogs, helicopters, volunteers who knew these trails better than I do. Marcus finished securing the tent stakes and stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. Look, we appreciate the warning, but we're not exactly inexperienced campers. We've been doing this stuff since we were scouts. The dismissive confidence in his voice reminded me of every college group I'd ever dealt with, smart enough to handle the technical aspects of wilderness camping, young enough to believe that competence made them invulnerable. I'd seen that attitude before, usually right before I had to explain to parents why their children were being airlifted to trauma centers. I'm not questioning your experience, I said. Just asking you to be extra cautious while you're here. Jake was already studying the trail maps they'd spread across their picnic table. We're planning to hit the waterfall trail tomorrow, maybe push up to the ridge overlook if the weather holds. Nothing too ambitious. I finished the paperwork and handed Priya the campsite guidelines, though I could tell none of them were really listening anymore. They'd heard the warning, filed it under typical ranger overcaution, and moved on to planning their adventure. I'd done my job according to the manual, but something in my gut told me it wasn't enough. Radio's on Channel 4 if you need anything, I said. I'll be checking on you folks tomorrow evening. I left them to their setup and continued my rounds, but my attention kept going back to Campsite 7. The forest felt too quiet around their laughter and conversation, like the trees themselves were listening. By the time I finished my patrol and returned to the ranger station, full darkness had settled over the woods, and the only sounds were the distant voices of the college group preparing their dinner. The radio woke me up at 2:15 in the morning. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by Jake's voice, tight with an emotion I couldn't quite figure out. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Ranger Thompson, you there? I grabbed the handset, instantly alert. Yeah, what's wrong? There's something weird happening out here. Can you come check it out? What kind of weird? A pause filled with background murmur as Jake talked with the others. There's been this laughing for the past couple hours, kids' laughter just carrying through the trees around our site. My blood went cold. Laughing. Started around midnight, maybe a little after. Just this giggling, you know, like a little boy playing hide and seek. It moves around us in circles, never gets closer, but it won't stop. I was already pulling on my boots, my hands working automatically while my mind raced. Anyone see anything? Lights? Movement? Nothing. Just the sound. Emma thought maybe it was an animal at first, like a fox or something, but no way. This is definitely human. Definitely a kid. I'll be right there. The drive to Campsite 7 took 12 minutes that felt like hours. My headlights cut through the darkness between the trees, lighting up trail markers and camping signs I knew well. But everything looked different in the harsh, white glare. More sharp, more threatening, like the forest had moved around while I wasn't looking. I could hear the students talking before I saw their campfire. Quiet, urgent voices that carried through the still air with weird clarity. When I pulled into their sight, all 4 of them were grouped around the dying flames, fully dressed and sitting close together like they were trying to get comfort from being near each other. Thank God, Priya said as I approached. This has been going on for hours. Still happening? Marcus nodded toward the trees beyond their tent. on and off. It'll stop for maybe 10 minutes, then start up again from a different direction. I listened carefully, but the forest around us had gone completely silent. No wind through the branches, no rustling of small animals, none of the subtle sounds that usually filled wilderness nights. The quiet felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. How far away does it sound? Maybe 30, 40 yards? Jake pointed toward different sections of the tree line. Started over there, then moved clockwise around our site. Always the same distance, like someone walking in a perfect circle. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, even though she had on a warm jacket. It's not random giggling. There's a pattern to it, like the kid is responding to something we can't hear. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. I thought about Corey Johnson's excited voice asking about bears and wolves, the way he'd bounced on his toes while I explained campfire safety. What does it sound like? The laughing? Happy, Priya said quietly. That's the worst part. Not scared or hurt or anything, just delighted, like whoever it is having the best time of their life. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the heavy quiet that surrounded their campsite. I found myself thinking about the mushroom circles Frank and I had discovered, the surgical precision of those empty skulls, the way the forest had gone silent around each scene. Whatever was happening here felt connected to those discoveries, part of some larger pattern I couldn't begin to understand. The laughter started again just after 3 o'clock. It began as a soft giggle from somewhere in the trees to our left, the sound of a child finding something genuinely amusing. Then it grew louder, more sustained, like the joke was getting funnier. The sound moved through the forest with impossible clarity, never muffled by branches or distance, always maintaining the same volume and tone. All 4 students went rigid as the laughter traced its invisible circle around their campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and played the beam across the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any reflection of eyes or pale clothing. Nothing. Just the rows of Douglas firs disappearing into darkness while that bright, cheerful sound danced between them. Jesus, Marcus whispered. How is there no echo? He was right. The laughter should have bounced off tree trunks, should have been twisted by the thick cover overhead. Instead, it sounded like the child was speaking directly into our ears, close and immediate even though we couldn't see where it was coming from. The sound continued for nearly 20 minutes, circling their site with mechanical precision before fading into the heavy silence. We waited, but it didn't return. That's how it's been all night, Jake said. 20 minutes on, 10 minutes off, like clockwork. I stayed with them until dawn, my radio close at hand and my eyes constantly looking around the forest around us. The laughter returned twice more, following the same pattern, tracing the same invisible circle while we sat helpless and listening. Each time I searched with my flashlight and found nothing. Each time the sound was exactly the same, bright, happy, utterly wrong. When the first pale light of morning began filtering through the trees above, I found the college students packing their gear with grim efficiency. Nobody discussed the decision. They just moved with the single-minded purpose of people who'd had enough. You're leaving? Hell yes, we're leaving, Emma said, stuffing her sleeping bag into its compression sack. I'm not spending another night listening to that. I couldn't blame them. Let me help you load up. While they broke down their campsite, I walked around where the laughter had come from. The forest floor looked normal at first glance. Fallen leaves, scattered pine needles, the usual carpet of stuff that covered everything. But near the eastern edge of their site, where the sound had first begun, I found something that made my stomach clench. A hole in the ground, perfectly round and about the size of a softball. The opening went straight down into darkness, its edges so clean they looked machine-cut. The earth around it had been disturbed, dirt scattered in a rough circle like something had pushed up from below with considerable force. I crouched next to the hole and played my flashlight beam into its depths, but the light disappeared without showing anything. The opening seemed to swallow light the same way it had swallowed sound during the night, completely and without explanation. "Find something?" Jake asked, approaching with his loaded backpack. "You folks need to leave, right now." The urgency in my voice must have convinced them, because they loaded their vehicles without further questions and drove away within 10 minutes, giving up their planned week-long trip without a single backward look. I watched their taillights disappear through the trees, then returned to the hole that had somehow appeared overnight in the forest floor. Standing there in the growing daylight, listening to the returning sounds of birds and insects as the forest slowly woke up around me, I tried to understand what I'd witnessed. The laughter had been real. 4 independent witnesses could confirm that. But real didn't necessarily mean human, and the whole suggested something far more disturbing than a lost child playing games in the woods. I thought about Corey Johnson's empty sleeping bag, about the surgical precision of those torn-up animals, about the perfect circles of pale mushrooms that had started this whole nightmare. Whatever was happening in Olympic National Forest was getting worse, becoming bolder, and I was running out of normal explanations for things that seemed designed to destroy normal thinking itself. I couldn't sleep after watching the college students drive away. The image of that perfectly round hole in the forest floor kept cycling through my mind, along with the sound of that child's laughter carrying through the trees. By 6 in the morning, I gave up on rest entirely and drove back to campsite 7, telling myself I needed to document the scene properly before filing my report. The abandoned campsite looked different in the early morning light. Where the students had pitched their tent, only flattened grass and a few scattered pine needles remained. Their fire ring sat cold and empty, a circle of blackened stones that somehow seemed smaller than it had during the night. The forest around the clearing felt like it was waiting for something to happen. I walked directly to where I'd found the hole, pulling out my camera to document the strange opening before it could disappear or fill itself in. But when I reached the spot near the eastern edge of the site, the hole was gone. No trace remained except for a slight depression in the earth, as if the ground had settled after being disturbed. That should have been my first warning to leave. Instead, I found myself walking deeper into the trees, following an invisible pull I couldn't name or resist. My feet carried me along what might have been an animal trail, though the path felt too straight, too deliberate for wildlife. Branches parted easily as I moved through them, and fallen logs seemed positioned at just the right height to step over without breaking stride. The quiet pressed in around me as I walked. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, none of the small sounds that usually filled the forest during morning hours. Even my own footsteps seemed muted, as if the earth itself was absorbing sound before it could travel more than a few feet. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I smelled it. Death has a particular odor that every ranger learns to recognize. Not the clean scent of a deer that died naturally and was claimed by scavengers, but something else. Something wrong. Sweet and rotten at the same time, with an underlying chemical tang that made my nose burn. I should have turned around right then. Should have radioed for backup, called in a potential hazmat situation, followed every protocol I'd been trained to follow. Instead, I kept walking toward that smell, drawn by the same compulsion that had brought me back to the campsite in the first place. The mushroom circle appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. It was massive, easily 12 feet across, formed by the same pale fungi I'd photographed twice before. But where the previous circles had contained maybe 20 or 30 individual mushrooms, this one held hundreds. They stood in perfect formation, creating multiple rings within rings that spiraled inward toward the center with mathematical precision. At the heart of it all lay Corey Johnson. I recognized his blue camp shirt immediately, the same one he'd been wearing when his parents reported him missing 5 days earlier. The fabric was stained dark with dirt and something else I didn't want to identify. His small hiking boots, still laced exactly as his father had tied them that first morning, pointed toward the sky at unnatural angles. His head had been opened with the same surgical precision I'd seen on the rabbit and deer. A clean crack ran from ear to ear across his skull, and the cavity inside was completely empty. No blood pooled around the body, just like with the animals. The wound looked clinical, purposeful, as if someone with medical training had performed the procedure with the finest instruments available. But it was his face that broke me completely. Dirt clung to his cheeks and forehead, packed into his hair like he'd been buried for days before being placed here. His eyes were gone, leaving dark sockets that seemed to watch me with hollow accusation. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing soil between his teeth. I stumbled backward, and my stomach emptied itself violently. Coffee and half-digested breakfast splattered across the forest floor while I retched until nothing was left but bile. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip my radio when I finally managed to key the transmit button. "Frank, I need you at my location immediately." "Michael, you sound terrible. What's wrong?" "I found Corey Johnson." Silence stretched across the radio for several seconds before Frank's voice returned, carefully controlled. "Found him how?" "Dead, mutilated. Just like the animals we found, but worse." "Where are you?" I looked around trying to get my bearings, but realized I had no idea how far I'd walked or in which direction. The trees all looked the same, and the trail I'd followed had somehow disappeared behind me. I'm not sure. Maybe half a mile northeast of Campsite 7. There's a clearing with another mushroom circle. Stay where you are. Don't touch anything. I'll track your radio signal and come find you. I switched off the radio and sat down on a fallen log about 20 feet from the circle, careful not to look directly at Corey's small body. My mind kept going back to that first morning when he jumped out of his family's Honda, so excited about his first camping trip. The questions he'd asked about bears and wolves, the way he'd listened to my safety talk like I was sharing the secrets of the universe. This was my fault. Frank and I had found 2 dead animals arranged in identical mushroom circles, and we'd chosen to document and wait instead of reporting immediately. We'd treated it like a curiosity, a mystery to solve on our own time, while something was hunting in our forest. I should have connected the pattern sooner, should have realized that whatever was creating those circles might escalate to human victims. If I'd filed an incident report that first day, brought in investigators, and closed the affected trail sections, Corey would be alive. He'd be heading home with his parents right now, full of stories about waterfalls and wildlife, already planning his next camping adventure. Instead, he was lying in a circle of pale mushrooms with his brain carved out and his eye sockets full of dirt. The guilt hit me like a punch to the chest. Every choice I'd made over the past 2 weeks suddenly looked different. Every time I'd chosen caution over action, documentation over reporting, Frank's practical concerns over my instinct to involve outside authorities. A child was dead because I'd been more worried about media attention and forest closures than about the possibility that something was actively hunting in these woods. I heard Frank crashing through the bushes long before I saw him, his heavy footsteps and cursing carrying clearly through the weird silence. When he finally came into the clearing, his face was red from running and his ranger uniform was torn by branches. He took one look at the massive mushroom circle and stopped dead in his tracks. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "It's Corey Johnson," I said, my voice coming out flat and hollow. Same mutilation pattern as the animals, but the circle's 3 times larger than the others. Frank approached the edge of the formation slowly, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like recognition. He studied the precise arrangement of fungi, the surgical wounds on the boy's body, the complete absence of blood or struggle signs around the scene. "This is way beyond what we found before," he said quietly. "This is organized, intentional. We should have reported those first circles immediately. If we'd brought in investigators, closed the trails, maybe." "Stop." Frank's voice cut through my spiral of self-recrimination. We followed protocol. 2 isolated incidents with wildlife. No immediate threat to public safety. Any supervisor would have made the same call. But his words felt hollow, and I could see the same guilt in his eyes. We both knew we'd chosen the safe path, the bureaucratic path, while something was preparing to graduate from animals to human victims. Frank pulled out his radio and switched to the emergency channel. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Garcia requesting immediate supervisor response to my location. We have a confirmed fatality in the backcountry." The response came back immediately. "Nature of the fatality?" Frank looked at me across the mushroom circle, and I could see him weighing his words carefully. We both knew that whatever we said next would determine how this investigation proceeded, who got involved, and how much attention our forest would receive in the coming days. "Suspicious death of a missing camper," he said finally, requesting Head Ranger Martinez and County Coroner response. I sat on my log and looked at the trees while Frank gave GPS coordinates and more details to dispatch. The forest around us stayed completely quiet, as if every living thing had run away from the area rather than see what was in that perfect circle of pale mushrooms. Corey Johnson's empty eye sockets kept looking at me, and I knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how this investigation played out, I would never forget that accusing stare or knowing that my caution had cost a child his life. The sound of vehicles arriving carried through the trees long before I could see them. Multiple engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, car doors slamming with official authority. Frank looked up from his radio and checked his watch. That was fast. 43 minutes from dispatch to arrival. I stayed on my fallen log, unable to work up the energy to stand. Every time I looked toward the mushroom circle, Corey's empty eye socket seemed to follow my movement, and the surgical precision of that head wound burned itself deeper into my memory. The smell of death hung in the air like something you could touch, sweet and chemical and wrong. Stephen Martinez came out from the trees first, his ranger uniform perfect despite the rough terrain. Behind him came 2 men in county coroner jackets carrying equipment cases, followed by a sheriff's deputy I didn't recognize. Stephen moved with his usual deliberate confidence, but something in his expression made me nervous. He wasn't shocked or horrified by the scene. If anything, he looked resigned, like this was a problem he'd been expecting. "Garcia, Thompson." Stephen nodded to each of us in turn. "Show me what we're dealing with." Frank led the group toward the mushroom circle while I forced myself to stand and follow. My legs felt shaky, whether from exhaustion or guilt I couldn't tell. The county officials stopped at the edge of the fungal formation, professional masks sliding over their faces as they studied Corey's small body. "Jesus," the deputy muttered. "Kid can't be more than 8 years old." One of the coroner's men was already taking pictures of the scene from multiple angles, his camera clicking steadily as he documented the precise arrangement of mushrooms and the position of the body. The other knelt beside Corey and began his preliminary examination, careful not to disturb the scene. Stephen walked around the circle slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The mathematical spacing of the fungi, the surgical wounds, the complete absence of blood or struggle signs. When he reached the point where I'd first spotted the formation, he crouched down and examined something in the dirt that I couldn't see from my position. "Coroner's preliminary?" Stephen asked. The examiner looked up from his work. "Dead for about 5 days, which matches the missing person timeline. Cause of death appears to be head trauma with complete removal of brain tissue. Wounds show unusual precision for wildlife predation." "Unusual how?" "Clean cuts, no tearing or tooth marks. More consistent with surgical instruments than animal claws or teeth." Stephen nodded like this information confirmed something he already knew. He spent another 10 minutes looking over the scene, asking technical questions about decomposition rates and wound patterns, but his tone stayed oddly calm. Not the reaction I would have expected from someone seeing this level of mutilation for the first time. "Thompson, walk with me." I followed Stephen away from the circle, deeper into the trees where the others couldn't overhear our conversation. When we were far enough from the scene, he stopped and turned to face me with that steady authority he used for difficult conversations. "This is going to be complicated," he said. "Complicated how? We have a murdered child arranged in some kind of ritual formation. We need to call in the FBI, state investigators, maybe even federal wildlife services." Stephen shook his head. "We need to think about the bigger picture here. This forest serves over 2 million visitors annually. 23,000 jobs in the surrounding communities depend on tourism revenue. You want to tell me what happens when the media reports that some kind of satanic cult is performing surgical experiments on children in Olympic National Forest?" The casual way he discussed economic impact while Corey's body lay 50 yards away made my stomach turn. So we're supposed to ignore what actually happened? Pretend that surgical precision is normal wildlife behavior? We're supposed to manage this situation responsibly. Look, Michael, I understand you're upset. Finding the body, seeing what was done to that boy, it's traumatic. But letting emotion drive our response isn't going to bring him back. Stephen pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages covered with his neat handwriting. Black bear activity has increased significantly in this sector over the past month. 3 separate sightings reported by day hikers, 2 instances of camp food theft, 1 tent damaged by claws while searching for stored provisions. Those wounds weren't made by bear claws. Wildlife behavior can be unpredictable, especially when animals are stressed by drought conditions or territory disputes. A desperate bear attacking a child might produce injuries that appear unusual to untrained observers. I stared at him. Untrained observers? Stephen, I've seen what bears do to people. This isn't even close to the same thing. What you've seen is limited wilderness experience compared to the biological complexities of predator behavior under environmental stress. The county coroner will perform a complete autopsy, and I'm confident his findings will support a wildlife attack conclusion. The certainty in his voice sent a chill down my spine. Stephen wasn't speculating about what the coroner might find. He was stating what the coroner would find, like the conclusion had already been determined. The surgical precision of those cuts can be explained by the angle of attack and the natural sharpness of bear claws when properly motivated. You're overthinking this, Michael. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Stephen closed his notebook and fixed me with that steady stare that had ended countless arguments over the years. When the media arrives, and they will arrive within hours, you're going to explain that young Corey Johnson wandered away from his campsite during the night and was attacked by a black bear. Tragic but understandable wilderness accident. The kind of thing that happens when proper safety protocols aren't followed. My hands turned into fists. His parents followed every safety protocol. They stored their food correctly, kept their campsite clean, did everything right, except watch their child closely enough to prevent him from leaving the tent alone in the middle of the night. The criticism of the Johnson family hit me hard. These people had trusted me to keep their son safe, had relied on my expertise and knowledge of the forest. Now Stephen wanted me to blame them for their child's death while covering up the real circumstances. I won't do it. Stephen's expression didn't change, but something moved in his posture. The collegial tone disappeared, replaced by the voice he used when giving direct orders. You will do it because it's your job. Because protecting public safety sometimes means making difficult choices about information management, and because refusing will end your career with the Forest Service permanently. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. Stephen had the authority to destroy my professional life with a single bad performance review, and we both knew it. 20 years of wilderness experience, countless successful rescues, every commendation I'd earned over the years, all of it could disappear if I crossed him on this. Think about the consequences, Michael. Mass panic about cult activity or unknown predators means immediate closure of the entire Olympic National Forest system. Congressional hearings, budget cuts, staff layoffs, Thousands of families who depend on tourism revenue lose their livelihoods, all because you couldn't accept that sometimes wildlife attacks produce unusual injury patterns. I wanted to argue, to insist that the truth mattered more than economic considerations, but his authority pressed down on me. This was how the system worked, how it had always worked. Difficult truths got simplified into manageable narratives that wouldn't disrupt the larger machinery of bureaucracy and commerce. The bear attack story protects everyone, Stephen continued. The family gets closure and financial compensation through our insurance system. The public maintains confidence in forest safety protocols. Tourism continues supporting local communities. Everyone wins except the bear, and we'll make sure to relocate or eliminate the responsible animal. What about the mushroom circles, the surgical precision, the complete absence of blood? Details that complicate a straightforward narrative without adding useful information. The public doesn't need to understand every aspect of predator behavior to accept that wilderness carries inherent risks. Stephen checked his watch and looked back toward where the coroner's team was working. Media will be here soon. You need to decide whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. I thought about Corey Johnson's excited questions about bears and wolves, the way his parents had trusted my expertise completely. The surgical wounds, the perfect circles of pale mushrooms, the child's laughter carrying through the trees around that college group's campsite. Everything my instincts told me was wrong with this situation. But I also thought about my mortgage, my pension, the career I'd built over 2 decades of service. Stephen wasn't bluffing about ending my employment, and starting over at 35 with a bad reference from the Forest Service would mean abandoning everything I'd worked toward. Michael? The bear attack story, I said quietly. Good choice. Keep it simple, factual, and focused on established wildlife behavior patterns. The family will appreciate having clear answers instead of complicated speculation. We walked back toward the mushroom circle where the coroner's team was preparing to transport Corey's body. The deputy was taking measurements and photographs while Frank marked GPS coordinates on his handheld device. Everything went on with professional efficiency, like this was just another workplace accident that needed proper documentation. Stephen spent several minutes talking quietly with the coroner, their voices too low for me to overhear. Whatever they discussed, both men nodded in agreement before Stephen returned to where Frank and I waited. Preliminary findings support a bear attack conclusion, Stephen announced. Official autopsy will confirm details, but cause of death appears consistent with large predator trauma. We'll coordinate with wildlife management to track and relocate the responsible animal. Frank looked relieved to have a clear explanation, but I caught him looking toward the perfect formation of mushrooms, with confusion still on his face. The way they were arranged so precisely wasn't something he could easily dismiss, even if he accepted the bear attack story. The first news van arrived as we were hiking back to the main trail, Channel 7 from Seattle, followed quickly by 2 more local stations and a crew from the regional newspaper. They set up their equipment quickly while Stephen briefed them on the basic facts. 8-year-old boy. Wandered from campsite during the night. Bear attack. Tragic, but not unprecedented in wilderness environments. Safety protocols under review to prevent similar incidents. When they called me forward to speak as the ranger who found the body, my stomach clenched with each word I spoke. The lies came out smoothly. Professionally delivered sound bites about wildlife behavior and camping safety. I explained how bear attacks could produce unusual injury patterns, how desperate animals might display strange aggression, how even experienced families could underestimate wilderness risks. The reporters asked good questions. Why hadn't the family heard the attack? How far had the boy wandered before running into the bear? What safety measures might have prevented this tragedy? I answered each one according to Stephen's script, my voice steady and authoritative. This was what the public needed to hear. Clear explanations that made sense within their understanding of how the world worked. Not surgical precision or mysterious laughter or perfect circles of pale mushrooms that suggested something far more disturbing. The story ran on the evening news with my face prominently featured, explaining the circumstances of Corey Johnson's death to cameras and microphones. While tragic, this type of incident represents the inherent risks of wilderness camping, I heard myself saying. Black bear behavior can be unpredictable, especially during periods of environmental stress. I watched the coverage from my apartment that night, forcing myself to see how my lies looked to the outside world. Professional, authoritative, completely believable. The Johnson family appeared in a brief interview segment, Dave's face hollow with grief while Linda struggled to speak about their son's love of the outdoors. "We knew there were risks," Dave said to the reporter, "but Corey was so excited about his first real camping trip. We thought we'd taken every precaution." Linda nodded through her tears. "The ranger warned us about bears on the first day. We stored our food properly, followed all the safety rules. Sometimes these things just happen in nature." They believed the story completely, accepted that their son had died because of normal wildlife behavior, not because something was hunting children in Olympic National Forest. The bear attack explanation gave them a framework for understanding their loss, something they could process and eventually move beyond. But as I sat in my living room watching their broken faces on the television screen, I knew I would carry this lie for the rest of my life. Somewhere in the forest, the real cause of Corey's death remained active and unchecked, protected by official lies and bureaucratic efficiency. The mushroom circles were still out there, waiting for the next victim, while everyone believed the threat had been eliminated with the relocation of a bear that had never existed. I couldn't sleep that night after watching the news coverage. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dave Johnson's hollow face on the television screen, heard Linda's broken voice explaining how they'd followed all the safety rules. They believed their son had died because of a bear attack, and I had been the one to sell them that lie. The guilt sat in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I kept replaying that moment when Stephen had given me the choice between truth and career survival, and I'd chosen wrong. Chosen the easy path while a grieving family accepted a fiction about their child's death. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the camping registration records I'd brought home in my gear bag, flipping through the carbon copies until I found the Johnson family's information. Their home address was listed as Tacoma, about 2 hours south of the forest. Dave had written it in careful block letters when I'd checked them into campsite 12, back when Corey was bouncing around asking questions about bears and wolves. The drive to Tacoma gave me plenty of time to rehearse what I would say. How I would explain that their son hadn't died from a bear attack, that something far worse had happened in the forest, that the wounds were surgical, precise, and the scene had been arranged with disturbing intentionality. That I'd seen similar mutilations performed on animals over the past few weeks, and we should have connected the pattern sooner. I practiced different ways to apologize for lying to them, for participating in a cover-up that served bureaucratic interests over their right to know how their child had really died. None of the words sounded right. How do you tell parents that their son was butchered by something unknown while you helped authorities blame it on wildlife? The Tacoma suburbs spread out in neat rows of modest houses with well-maintained lawns and flower beds. I followed my GPS through several turns until I reached Maple Street, a quiet residential area where children's bicycles sat in driveways and Halloween decorations were already appearing on front porches. The Johnson house was a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a small front garden. The same Honda Pilot that had arrived at our ranger station sat in the driveway, confirming I had the right address. I parked across the street and spent several minutes gathering courage, knowing that once I knocked on their door, there would be no taking back what I was about to tell them. My hands were shaking when I finally walked up their front steps and pressed the doorbell. Footsteps approached from inside, and I could hear someone talking in the background, maybe a television or radio. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Johnson, wearing jeans and a green sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked exactly as I remembered her from the campsite, with the same alert eyes and capable manner that had impressed me during their check-in. But when she saw me standing on her doorstep, no recognition crossed her face. She looked at me with polite curiosity, the way someone might regard a door-to-door salesperson or delivery person. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Johnson? I'm Michael Thompson, the forest ranger who worked with your family when Corey went missing." Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. A slight tightening around her eyes, like she was trying to place a name she'd never heard before. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong house. We don't have any children." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her face, looking for any sign that she was joking or testing me somehow. But her confusion looked completely real. "Corey Johnson," I said, my voice coming out louder than intended. "Your 8-year-old son. You brought him camping to Olympic National Forest last week for his first overnight trip. I checked you into campsite 12, and he asked me about bears." Mrs. Johnson looked over her shoulder, and I heard footsteps coming from deeper in the house. "Dave, can you come here for a minute?" Dave Johnson appeared beside his wife, wearing a casual button-down shirt and looking exactly as I remembered him from the campsite. The same firm handshake, the same smart questions about trail conditions. But when he looked at me, his face showed the same polite confusion as his wife's. "This man says he's a forest ranger," Linda explained. "He thinks we have a son named Corey?" Dave frowned and studied my face more carefully. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think you've got us confused with someone else. We don't have any children." "No, you don't understand." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos, looking for the pictures I'd taken during their check-in process. "I have documentation, registration records with your names and address. You drove up in that Honda Pilot in the driveway. But when I found the photos from that week, they were all corrupted. Digital static filled the screen where clear images should have been, just like what had happened to my pictures of the mushroom circles." "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Linda asked, her voice taking on the careful tone people use with unstable individuals. "Maybe you should sit down for a minute." "Your son disappeared from his tent on Thursday night," I continued, desperation creeping into my voice. "We searched for 3 days with dogs and helicopters. You were devastated when we had to call off the search. You broke down when they told you about scaling back the operation." Dave and Linda exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They were dealing with someone who was clearly having a mental breakdown, and they needed to handle the situation carefully. "Look, I don't know what's going on here," Dave said gently, "but you're obviously upset about something. Maybe we should call someone to help you. Do you have family nearby?" "The bear attack story was a lie," I said, my words coming out in a rush. "I helped cover up what really happened to Corey. The wounds were surgical, precise, not made by any animal. There were mushroom circles, mathematical patterns. Something was hunting in the forest, and we knew about it but didn't report it because of bureaucratic concerns. And now your son is dead, and I can't live with lying about it anymore." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Linda moved closer to her husband, and I could see them both evaluating whether I posed a physical threat. "Why don't you come inside?" Linda said finally. "Let us show you something." They led me into their living room, which was decorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture. The walls were covered with framed photographs, dozens of them showing various moments from their life together. Family gatherings, vacation trips, holiday celebrations, anniversary dinners. In every single picture, only 2 people appeared: Dave and Linda Johnson, smiling at cameras, hugging on beaches, cutting birthday cakes, opening Christmas presents. No children anywhere. No empty spaces where a child might have been cropped out or removed. Just a couple documenting their life together over what looked like 15 or 20 years. "We've been married for 18 years, Dave explained, watching my face as I stared at the photographs. "Never had any kids. Linda's been unable to conceive, and we decided against adoption. It's just been the 2 of us." I moved closer to the pictures, looking for any sign of tampering or digital changes, but they looked completely real, with natural lighting and consistent aging across the years. Here was Dave with less gray in his hair, Linda with shorter hairstyles from different decades, both of them appearing to live exactly the life they described. "This is impossible," I whispered. "Sir," Linda said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think you need to see a doctor. You're clearly confused about something, and that's not healthy. Maybe you're thinking about a different family, or maybe the stress of your job is causing you to mix up different memories. I checked you into campsite 12. You had extensive camping gear, everything organized and professional. Corey was excited about sleeping outside, asked about starting fires and seeing bears. You told him the tent was reliable, that I would keep him safe. But even as I spoke the words, they sounded empty in my own ears. The people standing in front of me really had no idea what I was talking about, and their confusion looked completely real. Not the kind of rehearsed act you might expect from people trying to hide something, but real confusion. "Maybe you should call your supervisor," Dave suggested. "Someone from the Forest Service who can help you sort this out. You're obviously dealing with some kind of stress reaction." I backed toward their front door, my mind spinning with possibilities that didn't make sense. Had I confused the Johnson family with someone else? But their names were on the registration records, their address matched, their vehicle was the same. Every detail lined up perfectly except for the existence of their son. "We really do want to help," Linda called after me as I reached their doorway. "But you need professional assistance, not whatever it is you think we can provide." I stumbled down their front steps and across their yard, my legs feeling unsteady. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel while questions pounded through my head. Had I imagined Corey Johnson entirely? Was I having some kind of psychotic break, complete with detailed false memories and non-existent evidence? But his small body in that mushroom circle had been real. The surgical precision of those wounds, the child's laughter bouncing around the college student's campsite, the perfect formation of pale fungi. None of that felt like hallucination or stress-induced fantasy. As I drove away from Maple Street, I caught sight of Dave and Linda Johnson watching me through their front window. Their faces showed concern rather than fear, like they genuinely worried about my mental state. Not the expressions of people hiding a terrible secret, but of a couple who had just encountered someone clearly struggling with reality. The 2-hour drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of confused thoughts and mounting worry. Either I was losing my mind completely, or something far more disturbing was happening. Something that could manipulate not just physical evidence, but memories themselves, erasing all trace of events that I knew had occurred. The forest itself seemed to be rewriting history, removing Corey Johnson from existence while leaving me as the only person who remembered he had ever lived at all. The doubt had been eating at me for 3 days straight. Every time I tried to convince myself the Johnsons had just been confused or protecting themselves somehow, I remembered the real confusion in their eyes, the complete absence of any trace that Corey had ever existed in their house, the way they'd looked at me like I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was, but if I was losing my mind, then the physical evidence should still be there. The mushroom circle where I'd found Corey's body, the disturbed earth where the coroner's team had worked, some trace that events had actually happened in the real world instead of just inside my head. I loaded my truck with a folding shovel, heavy-duty gloves, and a canvas tarp. The drive back to the forest felt like returning to a crime scene, except I was the only person who remembered any crime had been committed. Frank had been avoiding me at the station, claiming he didn't know what I was talking about when I mentioned the mushroom circles. Stephen had been watching me with that careful expression he used for problem employees. The hike to the site took me 40 minutes through increasingly thick brush. I'd marked the GPS coordinates on my personal device, separate from the ranger equipment that could be monitored or tampered with. Each step deeper into the forest brought back memories of that morning when I'd followed an invisible pull toward the smell of death. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. The massive mushroom circle was gone. completely. Where hundreds of pale fungi had formed those perfect concentric rings, only normal forest floor remained. Fallen leaves, pine needles, scattered twigs. No sign that anything unusual had ever grown here. But I knew this was the right place. The arrangement of surrounding trees, the fallen log where I'd sat while waiting for Frank, the specific angle of the slope toward the creek. Everything matched my memory exactly except for the mushrooms themselves. I walked the perimeter of where the circle had been, searching for any trace of the fungi. Not even broken stems or discolored patches remained. The ground looked like it had been carefully cleaned and restored to natural conditions by someone with professional landscaping skills. More disturbing was the absence of any evidence that a body had been here. No disturbed earth from the coroner's examination, no markers left by investigators, no signs of foot traffic from the search teams. The forest floor appeared undisturbed for months, maybe years. I set down my equipment and began digging anyway. The soil came up easily at first, rich black earth mixed with decomposing leaves and organic matter. I worked systematically, starting from what I remembered as the center of the mushroom formation and expanding outward in careful sections. My shovel bit through roots and rocky patches, turning over dirt that smelled of rain and decay. 1 foot down, nothing but normal forest soil. 2 feet down, my shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. The resistance felt different, softer, more yielding. I knelt beside the hole I'd created and used my hands to carefully brush away loose earth from whatever I'd hit. My fingers touched something warm and slightly moist. I jerked my hand back and grabbed my phone's flashlight, shining it down into the hole. What I saw made my skin crawl. A small mass of tissue about the size of a tennis ball sat in the dark earth, pink and gray like raw meat, with visible veins running across its surface in delicate patterns. As I watched, the thing pulsed with a rhythmic beat, expanding and contracting like a heart. It was alive. I stared at the organism, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The surface texture looked disturbingly common, like brain tissue from biology textbooks. The veining formed complex networks that seemed almost too organized to be natural, and that pulsing rhythm continued steadily, as if the thing was breathing or pumping blood through an invisible circulatory system. As I leaned closer with the light, the pulsing quickened. The gentle rhythm became more urgent, faster, like the organism could sense my presence and was responding to it. The veins along its surface seemed to darken, filling with some kind of fluid that made them stand out more prominently. I reached for my phone to take pictures, my hands shaking as I tried to focus the camera. This was proof. Physical evidence that something unnatural was happening in the forest. Something Stephen and the others couldn't dismiss or explain away with bear attack stories. "Michael!" I spun around so fast I nearly fell into the hole. Stephen Martinez stood at the edge of the clearing, having come through the trees without making a sound. His uniform was perfect as always. Not a wrinkle or stain, even after hiking through thick bushes and plants. But what bothered me most was his expression. He wasn't surprised to find me here. Wasn't shocked by the hole I'd dug or curious about what I'd discovered. He looked down at the beating organism with the same calm attention he might give to a routine maintenance report. "You found one of them," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact, like he'd been expecting this discovery. "What is it?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. Stephen stepped closer to the hole and studied the brain-like mass without any visible disgust or concern. The organism's pulsing continued to accelerate, its surface taking on a darker hue as he watched. "Harmless fungus," he said. "Probably related to the mushroom formations you've been obsessing over. Nothing more than a curious biological anomaly." "That's not a fungus. Look at it. It has veins. It's pulsing like it's alive. Many fungi exhibit movement that can appear lifelike to untrained observers. Spore release, moisture absorption, cellular expansion. Nothing unusual from a biological perspective." Stephen's tone had that same bossy certainty he'd used when explaining Corey's death as a bear attack. Not the voice of someone discovering something new, but of someone managing information that threatened to complicate an established story. Before I could respond, Stephen lifted his boot and brought it down hard on the organism. The thing burst like a rotten fruit, spraying pink and gray matter across the sides of the hole. The pulsing stopped immediately, and a smell like copper and decay filled the air. Stephen ground his heel into the remains until nothing was left but pulpy mass mixed with dirt. "There," he said, wiping his boot clean on a nearby log. "Problem solved." I stared at the destroyed remains in horror. "You just destroyed evidence, physical proof that something unnatural is happening here." I eliminated a health hazard. Unknown biological material shouldn't be handled without proper protective equipment and laboratory analysis. You could have been exposed to toxins or bacterial contamination. Stephen pulled out his radio and keyed the transmit button. "Base, this is Martinez. I need a hazmat cleanup crew at the following coordinates." He read off the GPS location from his handheld device. "Biological contamination, possible fungal spores." "Stephen, what the hell are you doing?" He switched off the radio and fixed me with that steady look that had ended countless arguments over the years. "What I should have done weeks ago. You're clearly suffering from severe job-related stress, Michael. Hallucinations, false memories, obsessive behavior, digging unauthorized holes in protected forest land while chasing conspiracies that don't exist. The organism was real. You saw it yourself. You crushed it deliberately. I saw you having a psychotic episode, digging holes and talking to imaginary biological specimens. The kind of behavior that indicates someone needs immediate professional help." Stephen moved closer, and I could see something cold in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. Not the concern of a supervisor worried about an employee's mental health, but the calculation of someone managing a problem that threatened larger interests. "Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. You'll surrender your badge, radio, and any Forest Service equipment. A therapist will be assigned to assess your fitness for duty." "You can't do this." "I can and I am. 20 years of service don't matter when you're actively endangering yourself and others with delusional behavior. The fact that you're out here alone, digging unauthorized excavations, proves you're not thinking clearly." Stephen held out his hand, waiting for me to surrender my equipment. When I hesitated, his expression hardened. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Michael. Accept the help you obviously need or face termination and possible criminal charges for vandalism of federal property." My badge felt different as I unclipped it from my shirt. The radio followed, then my keys to the ranger station and equipment lockers. Everything that represented my identity and purpose for the past 2 decades. Handed over to someone who just destroyed the only physical evidence I'd found. "A car will pick you up at the main trail in 30 minutes, Stephen said, pocketing my equipment. "Dr. Sarah Chen has an emergency appointment available this afternoon. She specializes in stress-related disorders and work trauma." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me with something that might have been genuine concern. "Get the help you need, Michael. Whatever you think you've been seeing, whatever you believe has been happening out here, it's not real. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can start recovering." Stephen disappeared back into the trees, leaving me alone beside a hole filled with the mushy remains of something that had been alive and moving just minutes before. The forest pressed around me with that same waiting quiet I'd noticed near the mushroom circles, as if it was watching to see what I would do next. I filled in the hole with my hands, covering the destroyed thing with dirt and leaves until no trace remained of what I'd found. The hazmat crew would find nothing but disturbed earth and my footprints, adding to Stephen's story about my worsening mental state. The hike back to the main trail felt like walking away from my entire life. The silence in my apartment had become unbearable. 3 days of administrative leave stretched behind me like a prison sentence, each hour crawling past while I sat surrounded by the remnants of my former life, Ranger patches and commendations hung on the wall, mocking reminders of a career that had been stripped away in a single afternoon. My phone sat on the coffee table, its screen dark and accusing. I'd been avoiding it since yesterday, when I'd finally worked up the courage to review the photographic evidence I'd accumulated over the past month. The images that would prove everything I'd witnessed, everything Stephen had covered up. But when I'd opened my photo gallery, my hands had started shaking. The pictures were gone, not deleted, corrupted. Every single image I'd taken of the mushroom circles showed nothing but digital static, gray and white noise where clear photographs should have been. The shots of the rabbit with its skull cracked open, the deer arranged in that perfect formation, the massive circle where I'd found Corey's body. All of it reduced to meaningless pixels that hurt to look at. I'd scrolled through hundreds of corrupted files, my stomach sinking further with each one. Even routine Forest Patrol photos from the same time periods had been affected, as if whatever force was responsible had targeted my device specifically and methodically destroyed anything that might serve as evidence. The laptop was worse. I'd brought home copies of my incident reports, detailed documentation of every discovery Frank and I had made. The files were still there in the directory structure, but when I opened them, only blank documents appeared. Pages and pages of empty white space where my careful observations and GPS coordinates should have been. My personal notes fared no better. The handwritten journal I'd kept throughout the investigation showed only faded marks on the pages, as if someone had erased the ink while leaving just enough residue to prove words had once been there. I could make out fragments, surgical precision, mathematical spacing, brain tissue removed, but not enough to reconstruct any coherent record. Frank had stopped returning my calls after the first day. When I'd finally driven to his house yesterday morning, his wife had answered the door with a concerned expression that reminded me uncomfortably of Linda Johnson's reaction to my visit. "He's worried about you, Michael," she'd said, not inviting me inside. "He thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. Says you've been talking about missing children and strange animal attacks that never happened. The mushroom circles, Patricia. Frank found the second one himself. He showed me the photos. Frank never mentioned any mushroom circles, and he would have told me about something like that." When Frank had finally come to the door, he'd looked at me with genuine confusion and growing alarm. Not the careful acting I might have expected from someone participating in a cover-up, but real bewilderment mixed with concern for my mental state. "I don't know what you're talking about, Michael. We never found any dead animals arranged in circles. There was no missing kid named Corey Johnson. You need to get help, man. This obsession with things that didn't happen isn't healthy." Frank's wife had nodded in agreement, explaining that he'd come home from work increasingly worried about my behavior over the past few weeks. According to her, Frank had described me as paranoid and fixated on imaginary incidents, claiming I'd been seeing patterns where none existed. He said you kept insisting animals had been mutilated when they'd clearly died from natural causes, she'd continued. Kept talking about surgical wounds that were just normal predator damage. The betrayal hit me harder than Stephen destroying the organism. Frank and I had worked together for years, shared countless patrols and difficult rescues. We'd written everything down together, talked about what it all meant, agreed on how disturbing our discovery was. But now he looked at me like a stranger having a breakdown. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with questions that had no good answers. Either I was completely insane, making up detailed false memories of events that never happened, or something was systematically erasing every trace of what happened while changing everyone's memories. The news records had been my last hope. Surely Corey Johnson's disappearance would have gotten coverage from local stations, newspapers, online outlets. The story of an 8-year-old boy going missing during his first camping trip should have been front-page material for days. But when I searched every database I could access, nothing came up. No missing person reports, no search and rescue operations, no tragic stories about childhood camping adventures gone wrong. The local paper's records from that week only had routine community news and high school sports results. I called the sheriff's department directly, claiming to be a family friend, asking about the status of the Johnson case. The dispatcher had no record of any missing child investigation in Olympic National Forest. When I pressed for details, providing dates and search coordinator names, she suggested I might be thinking of a different county or time period. Sometimes these cases blur together in people's memories, she'd said kindly, especially if you've been following a lot of true crime stories or watching documentaries. The details can feel very real even when they're not. Even the camping registration records had gone missing. I'd gotten into the ranger station database remotely using my personal login credentials, searching for the Johnson family's check-in documentation. The system showed no record of anyone by that name camping during the relevant dates. No blue Honda Pilot, no excited 8-year-old asking about bears, no careful parents planning their son's first wilderness experience. According to every official record, the Johnson family had never existed. I'd started to doubt my own sanity until I'd found one final piece of evidence that stopped me cold. Deep in my jacket pocket, forgotten since that first morning, was a small pine cone Corey had given me while his parents were setting up their tent. He'd found it near their campsite and declared it the perfect shape, pressing it into my hand with the serious generosity only children had. The pine cone was real, solid and real, its scale still carrying the faint scent of forest air. Physical proof that Corey Johnson had lived, had walked through that wilderness, had touched this simple object before giving it to me with a gap-toothed smile. I'd held that pine cone for an hour, rolling it between my fingers while tears I hadn't expected streamed down my face. Whatever force controlled the forest could manipulate photographs and computer records, could change memories and erase documentation, but it couldn't reach into my pocket and unmake a gift from a dead child. The realization of what I was facing had settled over me. Not just a cover-up by corrupt officials or a conspiracy by human actors, but something far beyond ordinary understanding. An intelligence that could rewrite reality itself, erasing people from existence while leaving only scattered fragments for those it chose to remember. I understood now why Stephen had been so confident about managing the situation. He hadn't been worried about evidence surfacing because he'd known it would disappear. He hadn't been concerned about witness testimony because the witnesses would forget. The bear attack story wasn't really for the public. It was for the few people like me who retained enough memory to need an explanation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist Stephen had assigned to evaluate my fitness for duty. She wanted to schedule a follow-up appointment, noting that my previous session had shown concerning signs of persistent delusional thinking that required immediate intervention. I'd attended that first appointment 3 days ago, still clinging to the hope that someone would believe me if I explained everything carefully and logically. Dr. Chen had listened with professional patience while I described the mushroom circles, the surgical mutilations, the missing child, and the systematic cover-up that followed. Her notes had probably used words like paranoid ideation and elaborate false memory syndrome. She'd prescribed medication for anxiety and depression while strongly recommending intensive therapy to address what she'd characterized as work-related trauma manifesting as complex hallucinations. The mind often creates elaborate scenarios to process stress and guilt, she'd explained. Your subconscious may have constructed these detailed false memories as a way of expressing your fear of failing to protect the people who trust you. It's actually quite common among first responders and caregivers. The medication bottles sat unopened on my kitchen counter. I couldn't bring myself to take pills designed to make me forget what had happened, to chemically erase the last traces of Corey Johnson's existence from my mind. My lease would expire in 2 months. My savings account contained enough money to last maybe 6 more months after that if I lived carefully. I couldn't return to work at Olympic National Forest even if Stephen eventually cleared me for duty. I'd never be able to walk those trails again without seeing the ghosts of erased victims. But I also knew that leaving wouldn't protect me from what I'd discovered. The forest had marked me as surely as it had claimed Corey Johnson. I would spend whatever time remained wondering when the next child would disappear, knowing I'd been made powerless to prevent it or even prove it had happened. The worst part was the isolation. Not just the loss of my job or career, but the complete cutting off of any connection to shared reality. Everyone I'd trusted now looked at me like a patient who needed help rather than someone who'd witnessed something terrible. The truth I carried felt like a poison that turned every relationship toxic. I picked up Corey's pine cone from the coffee table. Such a small thing to represent an entire human life, a child's dreams and laughter and endless curiosity about the world. In a few years, even this would probably crumble to dust, leaving nothing to prove he'd ever existed except my increasingly questionable memories. Somewhere in Olympic National Forest, the pale mushrooms were probably growing in new patterns, mathematical formations that would soon frame fresh horrors. Other families would trust their children to the wilderness, believing in the safety that competent rangers like me were supposed to provide. And when those children vanished, the forest would erase them too, leaving only empty spaces where love and life had been. I was the only person left who remembered that Corey Johnson had ever lived, and I was increasingly viewed as insane for maintaining that memory. The perfect crime, committed by something that operated beyond human justice or understanding. The forest had won completely, and I would spend the rest of my life haunted by the knowledge of just how powerless I'd always been to stop it.